Good morning, everybody. This is the TSMU fan here, and today we'll be continuing the 75th anniversary review-a-thon with my review of the Thomas & Friends movie The Great Race, the fifth and last movie animated by ARC Productions and the fifth movie written by Andrew Brenner. So without further ado, let's get this review started. The plot of this movie is that a big railway show is happening on the mainland, and engines from all around the world have arrived to take part in it. Thomas hears about the events from the famous 100 miles per hour record breaker, the Flying Scotsman at Vickerstown Station, and is in awe of the big green engine taking part in the speed competition. When a big ship arrives at the docks, it's revealed that the ship transporting the competitors to the Great Railway Show had taken a wrong turn and ended up at Sodor by mistake. When the engines get back on the ship, they leave behind an Indian tank engine named Ashima. After seeing all of the foreign engines from around the world, Thomas wants to enter the Great Railway Show himself. But no matter how hard Thomas tries, he can't convince Sir Topham Hatt to take him along after he gets into a big accident involving Diesel wanting to get into the show himself. When Thomas learns about Gordon missing his safety valve after getting streamlined into the shooting star, Thomas bravely jumps over the Vickerstown Bridge to get to the railway show. Once there, he tries to give Gordon his safety valve back, but when he arrives at the speed competition, the race starts and Gordon bursts his boiler trying to race without his safety valve. Later, Percy drops out of the shunting competition and tells Thomas to take his place, and while Thomas is shunting, he saves Philip, the diesel box cab, from a big bully steam engine named Vinny. When the shunting competition starts back up again, Thomas notices a flatbed on the tracks that Ashima is about to run into, so he quickly switches himself onto the blocked tracks to let Ashima win the shunting competition. But somehow, Thomas ends up winning the trophy anyways? Okay. Anyways, the engines all head home with Ashima so that she can catch her boat, which for some reason is coming back to Sodor. When they arrive at Vickerstown, they receive a warm welcome for the victory at the Great Railway Show. First of all, let's start off with the bad things that were in this movie, because there are a lot of them in this movie. First off, let's start off with the obvious elephant in the room. The bridge jump sequence. As I mentioned in my Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure review, it was pretty clear that the Brenner-era movies before this one were not made just for the sole purpose of selling toys. King of the Railway wasn't great, but there was at least a clear and inspired idea present, as that movie was focused on castles and knights in shining armor. Tale of the Brave was much better than King of the Railway, as that movie's inspired idea was all about building the characters of the three mains in the series, Thomas, Percy, and James. The adventure begins was the absolute best of the best in my opinion, as the inspired idea for that movie was all about the original books and the TV episodes that made the show popular in the first place since it was the show's 70th anniversary. Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure was also really great, as its inspired idea was all about making an incredibly cinematic movie about pirate ships and treasure. All of these movies, even if they weren't that great, at least all had an inspired idea. The Great Race, meanwhile, well, it kind of does, I guess? The whole inspired idea for this movie is all about a railway show that the engines visit on the mainland and all the things that happen during it, which is a great concept, but here's where the problem lies. The problem here is that even though there is a clear inspired idea present, Mattel butted in and made the executive decision to make the movie one big giant ad to sell merchandise. And this is where the bridge jump sequence comes into play. It's pretty obvious that this wasn't in the original script, as the whole scene feels very rushed, and nothing regarding it is ever mentioned again in the movie. After Thomas jumps the bridge, he just arrives at the Great Railway Show as if nothing ever happened. Did he even get remotely damaged by the bridge jump? What if this came into play later when he tries to bring Gordon his safety valve? Stuff like this could have been cleverly worked into the movie to at least make the bridge jump scene a lot less infuriating, but no. The whole problem with the bridge jump scene is that it feels forced. Absolutely 100% through and through, no doubt. They forced this scene into the movie so that Mattel could sell this playset where Thomas jumps through the air, and that's it. But it's not just the bridge jump scene that feels forced. The international characters in the Diesel subplot is too. When Thomas gets to the Great Railway Show, most of the international characters' names are revealed when they don't do anything in the plot. In fact, When this movie was coming out, Mattel made this whole big advertisement for it, showcasing most of the international engines that were taking part in the competitions. But then when the movie came out, most of the international cast didn't do anything significant. They're just there as background characters, and the only reason their names were revealed at all was so that Mattel could sell toys of them, and then kids would recognize them in stores. As for the Diesel subplot, that also feels forced into the movie as well. Diesel wants to make it seem like he's stronger than he actually is so that he can partake in the strength competition instead of Henry. Now let me ask this question. If Diesel's plan was actually successful, and he actually did go to the Great Railway Show, how in the heck would he be able to win the strength competition? I mean, the movie even shows Henry, one of the strongest engines on the island of Sodor, struggling to move the train, so it's obviously heavy. What was Diesel expecting to do once he got to the Great Railway Show? His plan is so incredibly stupid! But that's not all, folks. Diesel's subplot also doesn't work because it contributes absolutely nothing to the story. The only thing it amounts to is Thomas having an accident which prevents him from going to the Great Railway Show, but then that doesn't even matter, because Thomas leaves pretty much as soon as he got there to bring Gordon his safety valve. After Thomas's accident, Diesel's subplot never becomes important to the story again. It's never brought up again until the post-credits scene. And again, the only reason why this subplot was even in the movie was so that Mattel could sell toys of the Diesels with their disguises on. The absolute biggest problem of this movie is that it feels forced. There is an inspired idea here, so I'll give Brenner that, but the problem here is that Mattel forced him to change the script to make it one big merchandising gimmick. Another problem that I see with the movie is that Thomas's story is the main focus here. Before in Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, it was at least fitting to make Thomas the main character of that movie because there were scenes in that movie of Thomas being cheeky to the other engines that just wouldn't really work with any other character. And it made sense for him to feel jealous of Ryan in that movie, even though Ryan didn't really do a whole lot because he got his branch line taken away. In this movie, Thomas wants to go to a great railway show and tries various ways to convince Sir Topham Hatt to let him go. He tries to be faster, he tries to get a new paint job, and he even tries to be stronger. But there's something not right here. This feels like a story that's already been done before in the past. Oh wait, it is! Anybody remember that one episode called Dream On from season 11? That one kind of nothing episode where Thomas tries to prove that he's better than Spencer is? Yeah, this movie is basically just that episode extended to like an hour running time. I mean, heck, even the same pattern of the 3 strikes formula in that episode is used in this movie. I mean, come on! I know that sometimes it's hard to come up with plots for stories, and that's why some of the stories written for the show have been reused for later episodes, such as Old Reliable Edward, which for the most part follows the same premise as Edward the Very Useful Engine from season 6. But surely you can't be as lazy as reusing the same exact story with almost no changes to how it played out. And because Thomas's story is the main focus of the movie, not enough time is spent on the Great Railway Show itself. It takes about half the movie watching through all this boring filler with Thomas just to get to the show itself, and that's a problem. This movie is called The Great Race, but since Thomas is the focus of the story, the race doesn't even happen until like the end of the movie. Once again, like with my Adventure Begins and Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure review videos, I definitely agree with the Unlucky Tug when he uploaded his Great Race review video in 2016. I agree with him that Gordon should have been the main focus of this movie and not Thomas. Gordon's story has a lot more interesting character dynamics, and the way the Unlucky Tug presented the rewrite on how to fix the Great Race in his review video is definitely how this movie should have been approached. With that though, I think that might just be everything wrong with this movie. So now let's move on to the positives of this movie. I can't talk about the good things in this movie without mentioning the Flying Scotsman, who made his first full appearance in the series in this movie. Before this, the only part of him we saw were his 2 tenders in the episode Tender Engines. So it's really nice that they introduced him in this movie, and I really like how he and Gordon have a sort of sibling rivalry, seeing as they are both engines that were built in Doncaster, making them brothers. I really wish that this relationship Gordon has with the Flying Scotsman was expanded upon more, as this is definitely one of the best parts of the movie for sure. Speaking of Gordon and the Flying Scotsman's relationship with each other, let's talk about that. When the Flying Scotsman is introduced for the first time, he tells Gordon that he will be racing in the Great Railway Show. Of course, this naturally makes Gordon jealous, so he tries to prove that he is better than his brother by getting streamlined into a much faster engine. I absolutely love how when Gordon sees the Flying Scotsman at the Great Railway Show, show, the Flying Scotsman immediately brushes off Gordon bragging to him, which of course makes him even more jealous. Then when the great race actually gets underway, Gordon races even though he's missing his safety valve. I absolutely love how when things start to go wrong, the Flying Scotsman is very concerned for Gordon's safety, but Gordon of course doesn't stop and ends up bursting his boiler and nearly dying just to prove that he is faster than his brother. I absolutely love how this movie shows us just how far Gordon is willing to go just to outshine his brother. And I also really love how later when the engines are all leaving, the Flying Scotsman admits that Gordon was a lot tougher than he thought for racing even though he was in no condition to. Again, I really wish that this was expanded upon more in the movie, and I really do wish that Gordon was the main character so that we could see more of the Flying Scotsman. Another thing that I really liked about this movie were the songs. When this movie was first coming out, and the official trailer confirmed that this movie was going to be a musical,
join Thomas.
Maybe I can do anything I want to.
In a thrilling musical adventure.
I'm full of surprises.
Are you singing, Diesel?
I was honestly a little upset by that. Neither of the other movies before this were musicals, unless you count Magic Railroad, Calling All Engines, and The Great Discovery. But I will say that the songs in this movie are really catchy, and all of them are just so memorable. I absolutely love how pretty much every single character in the show gets a singing part in Will You Won't You. I absolutely love just how much of a jam both versions of Streamlining are, especially with that incredibly awesome guitar solo in Thomas's version. I'm Full of Surprises is a pretty catchy song with Diesel. You Can Only Be You is a really nice duet piece with Thomas and Ashima, and Be Who You Are is a pretty okay song to end the movie on. I will definitely say that Chris Renshaw definitely went to town on the songs in this movie. And speaking of Chris Renshaw, let's talk about the music in this special. As I mentioned in my last review video, Robert and Peter Hartshorn did not return for this movie, and Chris Renshaw was hired to be the new musical composer for the series moving forward. I'll definitely say that Renshaw does a very good job with composing music in this movie, but his stuff is definitely not as memorable as Hartshorn's music in previous episodes and specials. Anyways, another thing that I really liked about this movie was all of the stuff regarding the Great Railway Show. When the movie finally stopped showing Thomas screwing around on Sodor, the things that happen at the Great Railway Show are all really cool, and it's interesting seeing so many engines from around the world all in one place. This is also true for the scene where the international engines all come off the boat at Brendam. And even though the international characters don't really do a whole lot in this movie, I will say that that scene was a very good introduction to them. Another thing that I really liked about this movie is how Henry was portrayed. Before this, Henry was portrayed as a sort of nothing wimpy character afraid of the most simplest of things in both The Adventure Begins and Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure. So I really like how this movie changed it up a bit and actually showed us some of Henry's strong side in the strength competition. And I love how they never showed Henry as a warrior sort of character at all in this. I really wish that they could have handled Henry like this in the series, but alas. Another thing that I really liked about this movie was how funny it was. There aren't a lot of them in this movie, but there are some really funny scenes in this here and there with Diesel, and the way his subplot concludes is pretty funny and definitely gives him some comeuppance. I also really like the scene after Diesel's subplot concludes, where there's a pretty funny sight gag while Sir Topham Hatt is talking to Thomas. That was a pretty funny scene right there. But with that, that's really about it in terms of humor for this movie. So anyways, let's move on to another good thing that I noticed about the movie, being that when Thomas leaves Annie and Clarabelle behind at Marin, Annie and Clarabelle actually stand up for themselves when Thomas is harshing on Ashima for taking his coaches. This plot of the new engine taking Thomas's coaches and Thomas being jealous about it has been done several times before in the past, even in the last movie. So I really appreciate how they kind of finally had enough in this movie. Another thing that I want to mention is the animation. The animation in this movie is pretty good, but it's definitely not as amazing or great as the animation in the previous movie. Unfortunately, this was the last movie that ARC Productions animated, as they ended up going bankrupt and closing down in 2016, the same year that this movie officially had its release. Fortunately, the company was bought out by another animation company from Canada called Jam-Filled Toronto, who ended up taking over the animation for the show going forward. But I'll talk about Jam-Filled Toronto's animation in more detail when I review the next movie, Journey Beyond Sodor. Anyways, another thing that I liked about the movie was the references to other Thomas episodes. At the beginning of the movie, Thomas makes a reference to Thomas and the special letter when he's talking to the Flying Scotsman, and Diesel's subplot was a reference to how Diesel wanted to be stronger than Henry in the 6th season episode The World's Strongest Engine. Additionally, when Thomas goes back to Marin Station to collect Annie and Clarabelle, a reworked version of the Watermill theme from Season 2 can be heard, and the special itself could have been inspired by the Railway series book Thomas and the Great Railway Show. Again, all of these references to other Thomas episodes are all very nice. But anyways, I think that's mostly it for all the good things that were in this movie. But before we move on to the miscellaneous things I noticed in this movie, let's talk about the only international engine in this movie that actually gets focused. And that engine is Ashima. Ashima is definitely a pretty looking engine, especially with that eye-catching paint job that she has. But overall, I don't really feel like she's anything special in this movie. She's really just a visitor to Sodor who doesn't really have an in-depth backstory like someone like Gator, but I feel she's alright. Something that's kind of questionable regarding Ashima is the fact that when Thomas meets her for the first time, it's sort of portrayed that Ashima is a beautiful engine, and the way the scene plays out almost makes it seem like Thomas had some more deep feelings for her, if you know what I mean. But anyways, let's now officially move on to the miscellaneous things I noticed in the movie. The very first thing that I want to mention is something that I brought up in my Magic Railroad review, being that Splatter and Dodge were originally going to appear as the shunting diesels in this movie, but were unfortunately dropped. This is actually the second time that they've been dropped from a special, because as you all remember from my Day of the Diesels review, I mentioned that Splatter, Dodge, and Dennis were all supposed to make comebacks in that movie but were dropped. I really wish that they could have returned, since we didn't really get a whole lot with them in Thomas and the Magic Railroad, but I guess they're just too obscure of characters to appear in the show. Another thing that I want to talk about is the original planned version of this movie. So originally, this special was going to be released in 2015, but production was pushed back so that The Adventure Begins and Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure could be the movies to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the franchise. As seen in some concept art of Vickerstown Station, 3 Vickerstown tramway engines were going to be introduced in the special, but this idea ended up getting dropped, and they were rewritten into Rex, Mike, and Bert in Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure. The tramway, however, did end up appearing in the final movie if you look closely enough. This is kind of an interesting idea, and it kind of makes sense for Vickerstown to have a tramway system since it is one of the biggest stations on the island. Anyways, let's move on to another thing that I noticed from looking on the wiki, being that this special was released to tie into the 2016 Summer Olympics that took place that year in Rio de Janeiro. Additionally, that was also the year that the real Flying Scotsman finally returned to Steam. Yup, that's right. The Flying Scotsman isn't just a Thomas character, he's a real engine. Just like how Steven is the famous rocket in King of the Railway. Just like with Blue Mountain Mystery and Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, I think it's so funny that these movies were released the same year that something good relating to the movie happened. Another thing that I noticed was that when Thomas asks Victor to repaint him, he is shown with a Thunderbolt livery that includes a red and blue Thunderbolt painted over his right eye, resembling how famous singer David Bowie had a similar look on the cover of his album Aladdin Sane. Honestly, that's just a really nice and funny cultural reference. And another thing that I noticed was that in the Thomas and Friends character encyclopedia, it's revealed that the Flying Scotsman went back to help Gordon finish the race after his boiler exploded. This could have possibly been in the script during production of the movie, and I will say, that would have been a really nice scene to see the Flying Scotsman helping Gordon finish the race after it was over. Anyways, another thing that I want to mention is that this is the first special that Philip the Diesel box cab appears in, and for some reason, people really hate this character. I don't know, in my opinion, I think that Philip is a pretty good new character, and his arc in season 19 to me almost feels like something that a fan would come up with. I can see how people would think that Philip is annoying though, as almost every time he appears, he references the race he had with Gordon in the little engine who raced ahead. I can see how people would think that Philip is an annoying character, but I honestly like him, and he's a very unique looking character. Anyways, another thing that I noticed from watching this movie that I want to bring up is the fact that for whatever reason, the Flying Scotsman in this movie reuses Neville's whistle sound effect. I have no idea why they decided to use Neville's whistle for him and not, I don't know, the whistle of the real engine. But whatever, that's just a small nitpick that doesn't really matter in terms of how the story plays out. Another thing that I noticed was that the digital release of this movie was slowed down to 24 frames per second, which adds an extra 2 minutes to the special's length, and as a result, the audio is distorted. Well, I'm not even going to say anything this time to avoid jinxing myself, but just know that I am very unhappy. Anyways, I don't really think that there's anything else interesting that the wiki lists, and I can't really think of anything else to mention regarding this movie. So I think I'm going to end this review here. This movie was definitely interesting, to say the least, coming right off of the cinematic masterpiece that was Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure. I will say though, that even though there were some scenes here and there that felt forced for the sake of toy sales, this movie wasn't just a cheap cash grab. There was at least an inspired idea present in this movie, and even though the good stuff present here wasn't really focused on a lot, this was still a pretty okay movie. In conclusion, The Great Race wasn't really that great, but I feel it was an okay movie that had an inspired idea, and in the end, that's what really matters. Anyways, that's the end of this video, and make sure to be on the lookout for my review on Journey Beyond Sodor, which is the next movie. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. This is the TSMU fan signing out. Special thanks to my Patreon supporter, Red and Blue Panier 45, and I give an extra special thanks to a patron of mine who has chosen to remain anonymous. If you'd like to learn how to get your name at the end of every new video that I upload, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I've linked it on my YouTube channel's banner.